start, let me just make a very brief announcement. I was asked to tell you that there will be an SAP Distinguished Keynote later today. It's a plenary session by Professor Jarzabkowski, and it will take part in the Swiss Hotel in Chicago, of course, Zurich EF, and it starts at 1:15 and ends at 2:45. So for those of you who are interested, you should consider joining it. But now let's come back to our symposium today. Again, we are very happy to have you here. And let me firstly introduce our co-organizers for today. So my name is Stanske. I'm from the European University in Viadrina. We have Matthias Wenzel, we have Langley, and we have Eric Knight, who are sitting there, who will also later on organize the discussion, and also we will have some time for Q&A in the end, which will be done by Matthias. So we are very much looking forward for an exciting symposium today. And the topic of today is, of course, process studies. Process studies have become more and more popular today. They are more widely published in academic journals, and yet there are still some questions that we had and which we would like to shed some insight into in the course of the symposium. So first of all, we want to highlight insights about the most important contemporary issue of process studies. We also want to look at what constitutes actually a process study. And of course, we also want to look at the future of process studies. In order to answer these questions and to shed insights to these topics, we have an exciting list of panelists here today. So let me very briefly just introduce you to them. I think everybody knows them, but still we have Raghu sitting here in the middle. He is from Penn State University. We have Paula Jarzabkowski, who's from the City University in London. We have Langley from HEC Montréal. We have Tsoukas, who's from the University of Cyprus, or the University of Warwick. And we have Wenzel from the University of Minnesota. So we are very excited to have a discussion later on. But before we dive into the discussion, we ask our panelists to provide a 3-minute introduction on their take of process studies, and maybe to provide already first insights into their take on process studies. So as a first panelist, let me introduce to you Raghu, and he will tell you more about his take on process studies. Yeah.
I presume you can hear me. The first thing I will say is the people in the back, if you want to come and sit out here, please do so. It's up to you. Well, good morning, folks, and it's a pleasure to come and talk to you about my own journey about process and where I think that I have reached, and as a result, where the field has reached as well. So when I first joined I came as a PhD student. I was an engineer by background, and for me the notion of process was there was an input, there was a process, and there was an output, and the process was a black box. I happened to meet Wenzel, who Andy told me, forget about variance theorization and start thinking about process theorization. I said, what is process theorization? He says, ask questions about how things happen. And I said, fine, let's talk about how things happen. And from that, we spoke about Larry Moore, in which there is a distinction between variance theorization and process theorization. And so in that, in the MERP studies, we started talking about events and how events happen and how the events create a pattern over time. So there was a big shift from the process as a black box to process as variance, in which there are changes in things, and you create a process model, to process as events, in which there are patterns. And then I met other people, Tsoukas and Langley, Thor Hearns, Paula, for instance, and what they started doing was, they started talking about temporality, started thinking about how people think about time itself. And once you start doing that, then you move even further than process as patterns of events to processes as how people experience things. That is how they become things, right? And so how people experience things endogenizes the notion of time itself. The reason I'm saying this to you, I have just 3 minutes at the moment, is to say that the question which was asked is, how far have we come with process? And my answer was, we have come a long way, baby. And then I said, have we come too far? or have we not come far enough? I'll have to qualify those in two other questions which were asked of us, and that is, what kind of methodological issues does this implicate? And to me, the way of looking at it is that it's got a very specific, if you go from the process as an engineer to process as what's called the strong form of becoming, these are different notions of processes. And what that means is there are different onto-epistemological packages required for each of them. And so if you come, the strong form of process, it is a distributed ontology, for instance, and time and temporality is endogenized. So the onto-epistemological package there is very different from the one as process models and variance theories, for instance, or as an engineer. So we have to be very clear about that. And the question is, have we come a long way? We may have come too far off philosophically, thinking of the strong form, but do we have the methods for that, for instance? And the last question which was asked was, what are the opportunities do we have? And what threats do we have in this? And the main thing for me is when a strong form process is written and it is reviewed and evaluated by those people who are taking a weak form or a variance form of process, then it will be selected out. We have established legitimacy. There are a lot of good examples you'll see now. But yet, if we are not very careful, then a lot of hard work of ours, when it goes out, it might be rejected for the wrong reasons. So having said that, I think I've exhausted my 3 minutes, and I'm going to give it to the next person.
Thanks, Raghu. I'll try not to trip anyone up or pull the infrastructure down, which will be a tough process. So I think that in addressing, we were given 3 questions to address, and the first one was how far we've come in my way of seeing process. So I think it's first important to clarify how I see process. And there are 2 key principles in that for me. You probably know me as a practice scholar. So the first thing that I'm interested in is doing, which is what I would call the practice, what people are doing at any moment in time. And doing can be really quite mundane things. In the work that we've done, we've looked at people putting on ties, knocking on doors. These are doings. But of course, doing in isolation is not terribly interesting. We don't want a theory of putting on ties. The thing that is important to me is also the notion of becoming, which is where I see the unfolding of doing over time and the interconnection of doing over time. And so it's this continuous interplay between what we're doing in any moment and what that doing is allowing to become, or the unfolding flow of experience that arises from that doing. So the thing I think we've come a very long way is that you can actually use that language now, and I see people sort of smiling in this audience. They could be smiling because they think it's ridiculous, but mostly I think they're smiling because this is an acceptable language. Now they're like, oh yes, doing and becoming. And I wouldn't say that was the way, and I think that was a great history, really, because initially, it was still very much phase models and what's the shift between phase 1 and phase 2. And actually, there's still a lot of value to breaking down your data like that to try and understand what is this becoming you're trying to talk about, because a continuous flow of experience is very hard to talk about. And so when we talk about the challenges that I've experienced with that, if we think of things as always in flux, always unfolding, you still need some texture or tension in that in order to show what is unfolding. To show the river, you have to show some sort of thing about this flow to make it interesting. So that's one of the challenges that I've faced, I guess myself, working out how to show those tensions. And as part of that, I think that where can we go? I'd like to see process theory realize itself even more strongly. It's not a theory of things that just happen in organizations. I mean, process is the world we live in. And the Academy is trying to address a lot of big social issues at the moment, trying to have its voice in issues to do with poverty and climate change and risk and all these kinds of inequality issues. And I think that these are obviously interorganizational, intertemporal, processual phenomena. They can't be studied any other way because they're complex and they move between people and things across time. So it's not a frustration, I think it's a real opportunity. I'm very excited by the opportunity to try to do some of that. You can only be ever partial, but it's great to try and do that. And I think that the process methodologies we now have really allow us to at least explain some of those things. And if we can explain them, then maybe we can address them.
So I have a slide, just one, but I cheated a bit because it's actually 4 slides in one. But so I think as the starting point, I'd like to say, why are we even bothering about this process? And I think it's very important to say that this is not just an intellectual exercise we're engaging in for the fun of engaging in an intellectual exercise. We're looking at process because process is important, because temporality is important, because time is important. It's the one thing we can't escape. And also because, we think about all of our research, or a lot of our research is looking at how things affect outcomes. And what a process perspective enables us to see is that outcomes is a false concept in a certain sense. Time doesn't stop. There is no ultimate outcome. So we need to think about how things continue to go after that moment of our outcome. So this is why I'm so interested in this. And I'd just like to position how I see process research. And I recently published this book chapter with a student of mine, Fernando Faquin, and we suggest that there are 4 ways of thinking about process, not just 2, strong and weak. And the first one we call process as evolution, and this is very much the idea of process as change in things. So things exist, and what we're looking at is the evolution of things. And here are some ideas about how to study that, and all of this sort of written in a paper that I wrote in 1999. And actually, I think that this kind of reflection on process, we now pretty much know how to do this. So this is not where the frontier is. This is still extremely important to understand how things evolve over time. But there are some more challenging and interesting ways of thinking about process, which I think are worth considering. And as we move to the right here, we get a little bit more challenged as empirical researchers in trying to do it. Some of the questions that Raghu was raising come up. So the first one is kind of a substantive ontology we're looking at. The second one, which we call process as narrative, is a kind of experiential ontology where we're looking at process as conceived by people. So what we're looking at here is a kind of a narrative approach to thinking about process. So the kind of data that we're going to be using is likely to be different. We're likely to be looking at interviews because we're looking at how people understand process. This one also is kind of well established. So I don't think the challenges lie there. When we move a little bit further right, I see what Paula was just telling us about, the doing and becoming, very much here. And this is I'm very admirative of some of Paula's work, really bringing this to life. The idea that the world is made up of processes, of doing and becoming. But here you need to use different kinds of data. And I think we're learning how to do this right now. I call this process activity. And when we do this, we really need to get closer to the actual interactions of process occurring and what those interactions are accomplishing. Not the outcomes, in the outcome, independent variable sense, but what the activity that we engage in is achieving. This is a different way of thinking about it. And I think that we're beginning to understand how to do this, and I think this kind of research is beginning to penetrate the top journals. I think it's very interesting that this is happening, and I think there's lots of potential for doing that. one thing that one can also do with this is to understand the processes involved in staying in the same place, which is a kind of a paradoxical way of thinking about it, but what is it we need to do all the time to remain alive, to remain so that the Academy of Management is reproduced every year? Those kinds of processes are really interesting. We, in this paper, introduced a fourth kind of process thinking, which we call process as witness. And I'm not sure that I really want to engage with this, but I think this is what happens when you start to take a process philosophy to its extremes. Because if you think about it carefully, even when we research process activity, we sort of assume that the researcher is outside this process, that we are capable of looking at it and studying it as someone from the outside. However, if the world is process, then we too are process. So what if we were to think in a different way, that we were moving with those that we are studying? And this notion of witness comes from John Schotter, who wrote an interesting book and a paper in organization studies about this, which I invite you all to look at. And this becomes quite challenging because, on the one hand, we now have to think about being with others as we study with them, and also thinking about studying forward rather than backwards. Most of our research is about what happened in the past. If you take a witness perspective, you are in movement with the researchers. So how do you do research forward rather than backward? That's my 3 minutes.
I don't have a slide. If you don't mind, I will stand up. Too many years of teaching. Right, I'd like to thank the organizers for putting together this symposium, and I'd like to make 3 points in 3 minutes. Now, the first point is, as Anne and I wrote in the introduction to the process handbook recently, we distinguished 2 waves of process research. The first wave, up to, I think, about the 90s maybe, then from then on, what we call a second wave. Roughly, I think they correlate with, and please don't take it the wrong way, with a weak approach to process versus a strong approach to process. Weak and strong, for me, are purely descriptive terms, non-evaluative terms completely. It's because they incorporate ways of viewing change and motion. I think in the first wave, we have seen change mostly modeled on motion, whereas in the second wave, we have seen the effort to understand change in more complex terms. That's my first point. The second point is I align myself with a more strong process view, or a more strong view of process, and I would like to highlight 3 key features which I think are important if you take a strong process view, which correlates with what Anne was saying about the witness type of thinking. The first is, from a process point of view, we're interested in experience. Agency is very important in process, and the experience of agents is very, very important. And in fact, experience changes the agent along the way. I think all our colleagues here have done empirical research to show this. A very sort of an example that comes to my mind is Martha Feldman's 2000 paper in Org Science, where she describes the operation of routines and how routines change the agents who carry out the routines. So capturing the experience is very important empirically. Second point is about heterogeneity. Now, heterogeneity of experience is extremely important, and I think this is one of the distinguishing features of the second wave of process research compared to the first wave of process research. What do I mean by heterogeneity? I mean the following. Whenever we have no experience can ever be the same again. Think about how many times you have sat in endless academic meetings and you felt frustrated. Anytime you feel frustrated, it's not the same experience of frustration. Anytime we experience something that modifies us, changes us, there's a heterogeneity in experience. How do we capture that heterogeneity that is immanent in the experiential understanding of life? And my third point relates to Raghu's point. It is about temporality. Experiences evolve over time, so how can we find ways of capturing that temporal constitution of life? You know the classic distinction between the chronological time and chronological time, and I think we need to elaborate those distinctions in order to capture the temporality of life. Now, one might, I think, what is distinguishing for me about process research is that it gets away from the discreteness of life. That is, life is not episodic, it's not a simple sum of events, discrete events and objects, but trying to understand their interpenetration, the way they co-mingle, if you like. And this is, I think, it's a very relational image, which is difficult to carry out empirically, but I think this is one of the challenges. Some people might argue, might ask the question, but discreteness in life is all what's around us. Yes, pragmatically speaking, when I drive, I need to be very pragmatic in my driving to avoid a truck which I think is running into me. If I don't see life in those discrete terms, I may soon disappear. However, because we tend to view life in discrete terms, it does not mean that this is all there is in life. So what I see process research doing is trying to uncover those portions of life, if you like, which are hidden from ordinary view. I can expand on this in the discussion if you like. My final point, which is a plea. I want to make a plea for process and practice streams to come together. I want to see, this is what Paula said, when she spoke, when I want to see process and practice to be intersected. The logic of process is becoming. It is never to see life as a fait accompli, but as an ongoing project that is always going on. But the logic of practice is the logic of entwinement. The way people, when people are embedded into broader collective practices and ways of understanding the world, which is not necessarily conscious to them, but nonetheless they are embedded in those practices and necessarily draw on those understandings in order to act in the world. So if we find ways of joining together insights from process and practice, for me this is a way forward. Thank you.
What more can I say? This is just a rich description of what's going on in our field. And so what I wanted to do, perhaps, is to address my 3 points in the following way. First, to tell you that I'm delighted to say that the Oxford University Press has given us a contract just this past week to write the 2nd edition of our Handbook of Organizational Change, Process Theories of Organizational Change. And so what Scott Poole and I have been doing is reflecting on our 2004 initial handbook a lot during the past year or so, and thinking about what has happened since about 2000 in the field of organization, process theories of organizational change. And to answer that question, we say a whole lot. So in 1995, we introduced this typology that you could think of process models of change in terms of planned change, conflictual change, competitive or evolutionary change, and life cycle or regulated change. And since that, we have found there's a tremendous variations that have emerged in the field, so that what was a 12 or 13 chapter handbook now is going to become about a 32 chapter handbook, which tries to show and discuss the variations in each of these 4 basic models, plus a whole lot more, a host of hybrid process models, and a richer appreciation of some core concepts of change that the panelists have already been introducing. In particular, we want to point out that some of the new concepts deal with the concept of process itself, very much like the panelists just discussed. The importance of time and temporality. But there's also levels of analysis. The micro level emphasizing cognition, emotion, and interpretation. The meso level emphasizing the need to appreciate the differences in power and influence between different forces. Lewin discussed the point of field of forces for thinking about change, unfreeze, and rechange, but you can reconstruct that idea in terms of it's not just a matter of power between people in hierarchies, it's a great deal of power in differences between momenti of ongoing processes that unfold over time. So that you have the eddies, and you have the streams, and you have the rocks, and you know that behind the rocks is where you catch the fish. It's not in the rapid stream for him. And then we're also seeing at the macro level a tremendous richness and expansion in ecosystems. Ecosystems, I mean, not just individual firms producing products or services, but the whole set of actors, public, private, government, university, industry, markets, that are all intertwined and interrelated when you start thinking about emergence at the macro level, so that we begin to address how do the economic development and poverty and change unfold over time. And finally, there is this, as I mentioned, a great diversity in process theory. Then there's also some really interesting and important empirical new findings that we should be addressing that we've observed, such as the nonlinear dynamics of change processes that are beginning to be unfolded both qualitatively and quantitatively in a number of processes of change. And so we can begin to start thinking in terms of attractors, where people and organizations and things sort of swirl around, but then they spin out of there and go in nonlinear directions. Second, we need to think about the never-ending process of change. And for example, HEC Montréal identifying that organizations try perhaps to terminate a merger or acquisition process and want to go back to old things, and they show very clearly in their ASQ paper, you can never return back to the initial place. So the notion is there always is an ongoing flow in the stream. And to think or to hope or to strategize on returning to a particular state is perhaps a very important implication that we cannot do. So, as was already mentioned, timing and rhythm of change, but there's also empirical evidence that the organizations that change in a regular, moderate way on an ongoing basis are more successful than those that follow a punctual equilibrium process or respond to a need. This is Reich in the study of European banking companies. I don't know if that applies in other settings, but that's an important thing. And as I mentioned, there is a number of additional studies that are beginning to focus on the ecosystem, especially in the entrepreneurship and in the strategic management areas of macro organization theory. So those are some of the directions that I see going on right now, and they will change further, but it is very exciting to be a process research scholar. Thank you.
Thank you for those really fantastic overviews. I think there's a lot more in that, and we're going to help you unpick it. So the way that we decided to run this format is to have half an hour of a facilitated panel discussion, where we put some hopefully tricky and controversial questions to the panel to try and catch them off guard and maybe get a little bit of cross-dialogue. And then we're going to give time to you in the last half hour to kind of prompt those further. So the first question we want to put to the panelists, and I know this is really unfair because how do you pick your favorite child, but what is the #1 issue in process research right now? You're welcome to pass the microphone along if you want someone else to go first.
Oh my God.
I'm sorry.
Oh my God. We're all going to be dead.
I think we should.
Right up in the corpse.
We should bring the
No, it's
down.
the middle.
It's the other way. You can bring it back.
Bring it up the middle.
Yeah.
Or maybe we ought to move back.
I
The
just need a
number
quick
one
shot
issue
even-
is getting the microphone sorted in process.
I can only say from my vantage point, in this academy I was in 2 sessions. One was in the age of the Anthropocene, and it was an eye-opener. And I think that it is the number one issue for us in terms of what's happening to the climate, what's happening to our world. So we cannot think of it as in reductionist forms. It has to be holistic, it has to be systemic. The other one was a session which I got roped into in regeneration and how people can regenerate. So there were multiple papers which were being published or which were spoken at that session. So those are the 2 very important issues in terms of process, in terms of becoming, in terms of everything that we've been talking about.
Yes, I sort of agree with what you're saying, that if we really want to understand a world where everything is connected to everything else, that's part of the challenge. To be able to study those kinds of things, where it's not processes located in small places, but processes that intersect globally. And I'd like to pass the mic to Paula and tell us a little bit how she's doing.
Yeah, and I think when you do that, the thing you're going to have to accept is that process theory is a theory of contradiction. So we have, I liked seeing Andy's list, it's dialogic, it's dialectic, it's paradoxical, and you need to follow the contradictions that emerge because of these interconnections. These complex problems arise from interconnections between actors who don't even know that they are connected. And so, but we have the tools as process scholars to follow where bubbles, contradictions bubble up, problems, paradoxes, and how they shift between organizational actors, and perhaps help those actors to center themselves. People think it's not my problem, climate change, or it's not my problem, the increase in disaster. I've just got to deal with, the outcome of it. But how to help those people connect the different parts of the dots. And process is a theory that can help do that. We need to have process theories that are theories of also tension, paradox, dialectic. That is where I think we can get at the heart of this myself.
But I would say at the same time, we still need to focus on the small, on how things get accomplished in the moment. And so combining those 2 is one of the challenges. So the processes activity kind of perspective that I put out there requires us to look at process in the moment. But by doing that, do we lose the context? So we need both.
Because, I absolutely believe that. You can't study a global problem by going global. Well, where's global? It is local. You have to look at local things, but then how they connect to other local things and where that happens. So,
Before I give it to Hari, I'm the keeper of the mic at the middle. I will say the following, just 2 things. If we take a reductionist point of view and we take units of analysis, which are then co-varying and so on and so forth, then we do have a problem between levels of analysis. We really have to take a flat ontology, is what I would say, number 1. Number 2, we have to shift from these kind of units to holons, in which the narrative or the story actually contains the whole, so that we start overcoming this problem of levels.
At long last, I got it. I think it's the best way is. Yeah, that's it. For me, I think the main challenge is to capture life from within. This is easy to say, difficult to do. Now you can do process in a reconstructed way, where there's something happened, a merger, a change, whatever, and then you look back and you can see that is relatively easy. We have been doing it for years, that's okay. How do you report on life as it unfolds? How do you capture things in the moment as they emerge? Empirical, it's difficult, but there are ways of trying to do this. I think this will lead us to more narrative ways of understanding life, as Raghu suggested, and I think this is really quite important. And it will enable us to capture the heterogeneity of experience by zooming into the moment, into the way things emerge and flow, as well as, for me, it's the great challenge, not just process research of all social science, it's time. understanding time, temporality is profoundly important. And again, we need ways, more sophisticated ways of doing this.
Wow. I guess I would like to return very simply to saying that process is all about know-how, not know-what. And the field, by focusing on variance in process, variance models, is focused on causal factors that explain know-what. But we say most managers and most organizational participants are not asked to do know-what, they're asked to do know-how. Implement this, do that, change this, and the process by which things unfold, the steps, the sequence, the scripts, the stories, the orientation, the narrative that people need, needs to be addressed, and that's the most significant challenge on a wide variety of issues. We, as scholars, have tended to view process as some kind of a, well, obvious, proletariat kind of an activity. I don't mind addressing proletariat kinds of tasks that are fundamentally needed for managing organizations.
So I think we've talked quite a lot about different ways of viewing process and new ways in which we can theorize and push that forward. So now I'm going to push you a little bit more. So when we get our hands dirty, empirically, what would it look like? What are some of the new exciting ways forward? And I think there's been some hints to that already, and I know it's an unfair big question, but just have a go.
First, we need to know what it is that we're looking at. Do something is to answer in saying do X or Y or Z, or observe something. Notice how things emerge, are becoming. We need to identify the concepts that we're looking at. We can't see everything. So when we're taking a qualitative or a quantitative approach, there is an important need to focus on the issues. We then can conceptualize these as events or activities or incidents that people take, and we track those activities over time. Process is all about what happens over time, not across cases. Now you can add to that.
Backwards, always backwards. I'm
not the most qualified to answer this question. I think my colleagues here have done wonderful empirical research and they can offer more insightful advice. But what I can say is that for me, it's the importance of language. I think trying to capture the nuance of meaning, how new meanings emerge in a conversation. That is really, these are tricky points because new meanings imply new types of action, new possibilities, and how people act or fail to act on those possibilities. So my take would be language. But as I said, others are more qualified than me.
So as a scholar trying to understand the hearing aids, actually cochlear implants, I happened to go to 3 conferences, or more than 3 conferences, and they were otolaryngology conferences, NIH conferences. And what I did was, eventually I wrote about that as conferences as venues for field configuring events. And in that paper, I want to bring the audience into the conference, even though it happened many years ago. And so what I did was, I put in photographs, I put in text inside it, the scribblings of people, etc., etc. A conference like the Academy of Management, it is a confusing, ambiguous, emergent, processual account. The problem is that we can't write it actually in that way. When we write the account, it's very linear, neat, and clean. And so we send it to the journals, and they like that actually, by the way. Fortunately, this particular paper got through. So it is there. So when you ask this question as to what does it mean to write about process, we need more formats. And I will just say one plug. Andy did something which is the Academy of Management Discoveries, right? The format is a little different. So at least we have some chance for people to bring in videos and other things. He can speak about that later on if he wants.
So, that's right.
Okay, so I introduced those 4 perspectives up there, and I think that the challenge is really with the witness, one, how to address that, and people who are doing action research, I think, are somehow moving into that because they are looking forward with people they're working with, and trying to assist them doing that. So, but the legitimacy of that kind of work in our journals is kind of not yet fully established. So that's one thing. The other thing I would like to say is the process as activity perspective that I put up there. I think there are marvelous opportunities now with the availability of data and the ways and the facility of ways of collecting data that we can actually capture activities in the moment and interactions in the moment. And that there are marvelous opportunities. I mean, email conversations, they stay now. The conversations people used to have one-to-one now are kind of recorded somewhere, and on the internet there's all kinds of interactive things that you can see, and so there are great opportunities for understanding how things unfold that maybe were not there before, and that we should really be looking at those opportunities and seeing how we can develop process research based on that.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about myself a bit because I love data. I mean, I just love this thing of what's bothering you, what's the puzzle, how can you find it out? And so for me, I mean, the great thing about process research is it's not a very bounded method where this is process, but that's not process, and you're one of us. You know, you find a puzzle and then you try to follow it. And process is so wonderful for that. So one of the things we did, we were looking at a global market. We never set out to look at a global market. We were actually comparing 2 markets. It's still pretty big to compare 2 markets. We realized you can't compare 2 markets because market isn't local. I mean, market has lots of local manifestations, but market is, as a global concept, a global capital market. So you have to find ways to follow the local in multiple situations. And we learn how to do multi-site, multi-member ethnography, because we just were following things, and we managed to get a bit more funding. And so in that sense, I think that what would it look like? It would look like this thing we talked about. It has to have a flat ontology because you're not saying that the local is the global, but you can't possibly understand why it happens this way in London and this way in Bermuda if you don't understand how it happens as a capital market that flows relationally between all of those contexts. So in that sense, you need a flat ontology. You're not saying, oh, I am comparing London with Bermuda, like Andy said. You're not looking at comparative case studies. You're trying to say how these things connect. So I think, the opportunity is so amazing in process research. And right now we're trying to do another study of that kind, but sort of bigger and more complicated with more types of actors who span contexts, and we're just playing around. We're trying to find out how we can do that. We hope we'll have a little paper out early next year on how we've tried it. But I think that the opportunity is there for you to invent it. The techniques of ethnography and all that are there, but it's up to us to turn them into things that let us access these problems we want to access.
Jen, can I say something?
Yeah, sorry.
Where do you normally find the best process accounts? In literature, in novels. If you read Tolstoy or Madame Bovary or any major kind of novel, one cannot help but to be struck by the subtlety of description. Why? Because there's a lot of richness, interconnectivity, and there is a lack of analytical categories. This is a professional handicap, if you like. It's a handicap, but it's also an advantage. I don't want to belittle it. So the challenge is what can we learn from creative writers when we report our findings to be able to capture the flow? I think for me the writing question is extremely important. And then how do we modify, develop, make them more sophisticated, analytical categories more sophisticated to capture this? That contradiction will not go away. And so far as you try to be analytical, I think you're bound to lose some richness And the more richness you want to retain, the less analytical you'll be. But there must be a happy medium, something in between that we can do justice to both.
So I think this gets us towards kind of the grand scheme of approaching research. But if I'm, looking into the room and I see some of the early career scholars, pragmatically, what are some of the things that we can do to not only do great process research, but to also get it published? And you know a little about that.
So, don't do global research. What I just talked about, if you're just doing your PhD, don't do that. Okay? That shouldn't do. People will go, oh, how did you do your global study? I never did my global study. I did my study of this, and I did my study of that, I did my study of that, and they all joined up. Do an amazing study of something you can get your hands on, and just collect everything. You don't know what's important. Honestly, the best advice Anne ever gave me when I was doing my PhD, and she was very nice, she actually responded to an email. I'm not that nice. But you will always find something. You may not find what you set out to get, but you will always find something. Collect all that you can get and look after it very well, that data. Know where it is, record it well, have access to it for years, because you might then collect another data set about something like that, and another one. And maybe you'll write one of those amazing papers in 30 years, where you can look across all the data you've collected and think, oh, I did a global study. Because you will have done it over time. So that would be my real advice. Collect each piece of data discreetly, but love that data so that you can always come back to it.
Yeah, she's trying to kill us. Really? She's trying to kill us.
We did order a roaming mic, just so you know.
So I agree with everything that Paula said. I mean, when you do a PhD, don't think of it as this is the last thing, and the only thing that you're going to do, this part of a career that you're developing, and that there will be opportunities to accumulate material if you can think programmatically about your work. But of course, for the thesis, you need to think fairly small. So I can see sort of two ways. I mean, I talked about looking at process as activity. I think there are wonderful opportunities for doing that, and honestly, you don't need huge, lengthy time periods to look at activity in the small. So that's quite doable within a year's study if you pick the very important processes that are in the small that you can study. The other thing is, if you do want to look at something over a long period, which might be one objective that you have, start today. Yeah, don't wait. Don't wait until you've done your comprehensives. Start today. By the time you are defending your thesis, you will probably have 3 years of data. I have an example of that. I don't know if Hui is here, but he was a student at McGill, and the day he entered the doctoral program, he started collecting data, and by the time he finished his data collection, he had 300 interviews in a large telecommunications company, and has produced some wonderful process research studies with that, but he started soon, and so that would be another piece.
So there's a gentleman called Ludwig Fleck, who was before Thomas Kuhn, contemporaries at that point, I guess. He made a point, Ludwig Fleck, which resonates with me and perhaps might be helpful. And he talked about thought styles and thought collectives. And thought styles are ways of thinking, which is the process way of thinking is different from a way of thinking. And they come from thought collectives, of communities, of intellectual communities. Which North-Sabina might call as epistemic communities, for instance. I think the thought collectives is a larger concept in terms of not only the approaches, but also the metronomics and the instruments and so on and so forth. What does this all have to do with the question which is asked? And that is, when you think about process research, find out which kind of process research you want to do, number one, and which kind of thought collective that you want to belong to. And so submit your papers to those journals which are more sympathetic towards your thought collective or thought style. because you would be creating a problem for yourself if you were to send a certain kind of paper to a wrong place, because it will come back rejected as a consequence. So that's the first piece of advice I would say in terms of trying to get yourself published. The second thing I would say is that there is an AMR paper, which I forget the specific authors at the moment, but you're welcome to just go and search for it. And that person talks about the fallacy of processification and the fallacy of objectification. And what that is that if your methods are about static snapshots and you're trying to create a process theory out of that, which is more longitudinal, that's a little problematic. Whichever journal you're going to send it to, they will smell it and they'll say it's inconsistent. And the flip side of it is if you've got kind of longitudinal flow kind of thing and you're trying to make it into a kind of snapshot or a causal model, you probably are going to run afoul. And so my suggestion would be to try to make sure epistemology and ontology are aligned. And in fact, these science and technology scholars would say epistemology is ontology.
I think one of the good things of process research in the last 40 years and the first wave of process research is that it has legitimated the very approach. I don't think now editors will be surprised, they will not, it's unlikely, if they're relatively open-minded, that any paper that claims to be process-oriented, it will not just bring surprise to an editor. So that is a good thing. So I think now we're beginning from a much better position compared to 30 or 20 years ago. So that's point one. Point number two, you don't have to do process research. There's no necessity for it, only if you believe in it, which raises another question about thought styles and metaphysical beliefs. If you believe the world is at a deeper level, more processual and more becoming, then naturally that kind of metaphysical belief will inform your theoretical style, your thought style, inevitably. But it doesn't have to. But if it does, all you need to do is to bring process sensitivity to the topic of study. And as San said, you can do this at all levels of analysis, on a very, very small scale to the very large scale. I was reading recently again Charles Tilly's classic books on revolutions, trying to understand the French Revolution, a perennial question, for example. So you can talk at a very, very ground level, and you can talk a very minute conversation or a meeting and the way it is conducted and whether it makes and what difference it makes. So there are all levels of analysis, but one needs to be clear as to what level one pitches oneself to do the study. And the third point is to be pragmatic. Process needs to end. A piece of paper is not a process any longer. It's an outcome. When it is submitted to a journal, it has nothing to do with process in itself. It is about process in the phenomenon it describes, but if you treat it as a paper, it is an object now. It will be evaluated, commented on, and so on. So you've got to be pragmatic, draw the boundaries, and to be convincing to others. This is part of what I was saying earlier, that to be the need for to be discrete. The world is it consists of certain institutions, of certain objects. We need to be pragmatic about the way we do things, but and this does not necessarily contravene process sensitivity. It just means one is pragmatic.
Wonderful. I would advise you to consider the Academy of Amazement Discoveries. It is a wonderful outlet for thinking processually and writing in a processual way. It typically begins with a description, a simple description of what you saw or what you observe as unfolding over time, an emergent process. Description. Then, a puzzle. I didn't know, or the field didn't know this. There's a funny thing that happened in my description that I've observed. And so now we need to abductively come up with a hunch. Hari pointed out in 1989, what is a process theory? From a realist point of view, he suggested a process theory is an explanation for an observed set of events, activities, incidents, with a search for some causal, or not causal, but generative mechanisms that explain why it happened at that particular time and place. Is that correct? That is a process theory. So that the end of your paper is one that focuses on your explanation of why this observed event, set of events occurred in a particular context and place. That's your paper that you submit to the Academy. But before you jump to the Academy, also remember Ann Huff. Writing is a conversation. So talk to and write with and interact with your intended audience. You're not writing to a nameless, faceless journal. You are writing to a particular set of scholars in this community who are not only scientists, but who are also teachers, who are also practitioners, who are engaged in a wide variety of different roles in life. Search out and talk with a few of them before you write your paper. It provides you an understanding of what it is that is important, what assumptions you've got to make and address, and what likely concerns they're going to have so that you can discuss them in your paper. That's my advice.
So on that note of joining the conversation, we really want you to join the conversation. So I'll hand over for the Q&A, and Matthias will facilitate that for us. Obviously, this will not reach around the room, so if you have a question, you're going to have to shout it.
So we have about half an hour, so standing question. Yeah, first row.
Maybe I just start. Marcus Wright from Wolfana University. So I have to be a little bit provocative, otherwise, because I can agree with many things that you presented. I think when we look forward for what's the future of process theorizing, then I have three views. Yeah? The first one is we actually have to go beyond idealism. Yeah? So there are many interesting studies that focus on the world of ideas and discourse. That's good and that's great. But in fact, when we think about like climate change, when we think about digitalization, we also have to engage with the world of material, the world of matter. The second one is beyond relationism. Yeah? I know there's this term to distinguish substantive versus relational ontology, but I think that doesn't really get the point. Because what we actually have to understand better, and that's what you basically said, is we have to move towards a more systemic understanding. Because logically it's problematic because there are no relations without complements. So it's difficult if we just primarize the idea of relations. And the third one is going beyond experience. I share pretty much what Harry said, but I think when we think about experience and just reducing it to experience, it becomes reductionist because it's also about doing, but moreover it's also about ideation. And ideation is something which is beyond experience. And these basically start to interact with, we start trying to understand processes. Just three comments.
Any responses to that?
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Well, thank you very much. I just address only one point of yours, and I completely agree with most of your points. It was not that provocative, actually, I agree. But where I come from is coming from now gender studies, also, and STS, you know. And if you look at Karen Barad, and the notion of relationality is the interactions which happen. And coming from active network theory, materiality is a central portion of that. You know, in fact, they call it actants. It's not humans and materiality, right? And the notion of interaction is that through the interactions or through the engagements, our identities shift, the functionalities of materiality changes. If you come from Michel Collon's work of agencement, in which the arrangements and agencies in the arrangements, so that speaks directly to your point in the middle. To all of this, I will add not just ontology and epistemology, but axiology, which typically gets, nobody speaks about it, but that's the values which are there in our theorization. And I think that we are not given enough attention to axiology, that we ought to be thinking about in systemic terms as to what's happening. And the fact is that different people around the world have got different matters of concerns. So when we say sustainability, it means very different to people in India as compared to people in America. We need to understand that. Otherwise, we're just saying, okay, we'll just cut carbon and that's the end of that. That's not the way it is. Good questions, though.
Yes, just to carry on from Raghu's point, axiology is very important. It's the study of values. So this is, that's again relates to my point about practices. Only if you see agents embedded in practices and therefore being driven by certain values, then you can begin to understand better what it is that they do. But no, I don't agree that experience is reductive. Far from it, not at all. To try to capture the experience of a human being, I think it's extremely important. It is not just a purely cognitive or emotional matter. You have to understand the way agents are constituted to be receptive of certain kinds of experiences. So the broader community, if you like, or the broader context is going to be brought in. When historians try to understand the French Revolution, then one of the things they try to understand is how has the idea of public opinion emerged in 18th century France? How have new texts, new books, new pamphlets published at the time modified people's experiences about the legitimacy of the king, for example? When we see, these are very large scale kind of questions, but I think you can bring them down to kind of lower scale questions when we try to see the way people experience things in particular conjunctures of time, and then try to map it out and to capture it and ideally theorize it. Next. I have to do something with this.
I'll say something about experience.
I mean, I do agree with that very much. This issue, is always one of, when you look at things, is it macro, is it reductionist, do you reduce things? But actually, the very act of being human can never be anything but at the nexus of all this, it's the social, the large, the social is writ small in anything you can do. You can't be human and interact. You can't even have a thought that is not automatically relationally connected to the language we use, and the possibility of thinking is structured through this connectedness. So I don't think, I agree with Harry's point there. Very much that's why we study doing. As I say, you study putting on a tie. It's not a theory of tie you're looking for. It's what's doing in putting on a tie.
Raghu and Paula mentioned that typically process research goes along or goes hand in hand with a flat ontology. So would you say that a tall ontology, which means distinguishing between the micro and the macro level of the social, is incompatible with process research?
Good question.
I'm going to let Andy go first.
Andy wants to go first.
You have to answer it.
Andy wants to answer.
No, if flat means you stay at the same level of analysis, unit of analysis, individual rather than group or organization or larger society. And tall means you're cutting across those levels. Indeed, process studies really need to go across these levels because some of the events and activities are determined and driven by or conducted by institutions. The federal government has a law that says you do this, and if you don't, you'll go to jail. So if I have to connect the federal government and its institutions and its enforcement practices with individual behavior. So in that sense, to me, activities, events, and so forth can be, the actors can be large institutions, they can be governments, they could be individuals. Does that address?
Let me just clarify what I was saying, and then I will pass it on. If you're not careful, then if you take a tall ontology, what happens is that the things on the top serve as moderators or context. We don't operate in context, we contextualize. It's a huge difference for me at least. A flat ontology is one in which the government, the Federal Reserve Board, is an actor within the whole thing. So in that sense, the flatter the ontology, the better it is. And I come at it from, like I said, actor network theory, in which they try to flatten everything out there. But if you're not careful, everything becomes a context out there, and it's not a context. So we need a unit, a way of thinking, and a way of, I'm saying unit of analysis. I mentioned the notion of holons. A holon has got the whole in the part. Gareth Morgan wrote about that in holographic approach. Carl White wrote about that, for instance. Those ways of thinking, those languages are not available to us, unfortunately. And so we are asking what is the unit of analysis and which variable is changing and so on and so forth. That is not going to lead us to, it takes us more and more towards reductionist ways of thinking as compared to more holistic way of thinking.
I find a flat ontology very attractive intellectually, but we, there's a pragmatic, if you're going to write a paper, at some point you have to make cuts somewhere. You do need to pragmatically identify what you're going to focus on, and sometimes identifying levels is useful, and it does approximate part of what we're trying to understand, and a flatter ontology would give you a different process explanation. So I would invite everyone to try all kinds of ways of trying to divide up the world to better understand it. And I don't think, but there's something very attractive about someone who really manages to keep the ontology flat. There's some of the stories that you can see how small things are actually big things, and is really quite fascinating. How you can see the little conversation in the moment is producing something which is actually significant, more global. So that's a really attractive thing to do, but it's not for everyone, and you can still do process research by chopping things differently.
Everyone's already said everything, but I would just like to give actually our distinguished speaker a plug, because one of the things I've always been looking for are just underpinning theoretical ways of showing how everything is connected to everything. But as Anne said, it's not helpful to try and write a paper about everything being connected to everything. So you're also looking for social theories that have a flat ontology, but can also allow you to descend into the doing at this moment, in this time, by these people, and why is that the nexus of all the doings, and then move to this doing over here. So you do need to be able to do that carving up. So I would just encourage you to come to the talk by Tsoukas, because it was very influential for me when I was looking for theories. So, I take the actor network point, it's a very good one. We're all looking just for ways. I mean, you're not writing a paper about these things. You just want something that background informs how you want to explain the world.
I'll just give an example of a flat ontology. It may be difficult to publish, but nevertheless, you ask the question. So if you take narratives as performative as compared to narratives as representations, as a performative tool, narratives are intertemporal and they are intertextual. This is a flat ontology. A performative approach coming from Canon Barad's work or Butler's work is we become a woman. We are not born a woman. Okay, that's the main point, right? And so it is performative till at the same time in the speech acts, John Austin's work, in the very sayings and doings, we actually change. But the very capacity to speak and do is given to us performatively. It's a puzzle. It's a tension. So I'm just giving you an example of a flat ontology. If you start, there was a gentleman who just recently died, I think day before yesterday, Paul Naipaul, a famous Indian author. And he wrote a book, it's called India, A Million Mutinies Now. He goes to Mumbai and he looks at the Dalit, which is the social movements out there. And what he does is he asks a question to everybody. Please give a story of your grandfather and or grandparents and what your grandchildren will look like. In one story, in one half a page, and in about 5 minutes, the people recount, how their grandparents live and how they think that their grandchildren might be living. And he collects these stories, right? And he sees from that, when you read that, you start seeing what the aspirations of these people are, what kind of relationality there is. This is a kind of hugely flawed, flat ontological approach, I think. Sorry. You got it?
No, I'm a bit skeptical. I think some narratives are more powerful than others. Narratives become institutionalized, as Sandy correctly pointed out. The narrative of the federal bank or the government on certain issues is out there. Actors may draw on it, but they're compelled to draw on it, and we can study how they do so, to do what, with what effects. I know what the flat ontology colleagues mean by this, and I sympathize in trying to extend agency, to understand agency in broader terms, to see, to bring into the terrain other factors than what we have traditionally focused on. But at the same time, levels of analysis, I think, make intuitive sense. And I think trying to articulate links among levels of analysis, also, I find this a useful way to proceed. So yes, expand the terrain of agency, but also pay particular importance to the institutional power and to the different institutionalized narratives that we see in particular terrains when actors draw for their actions.
Thank you for some very interesting discussion. My question takes its point of departure in Anne's mention of witness as a path for going forward, and I sense that you were somewhat not all in favor of all the witness. What are your why isn't that a good idea? And well, I would like to have everyone's views on that from an engaged scholarship point of view. Could process research fit in there? Question one.
You want to start? Let Andy start with that.
No,
Well, Andy,
Yeah, it's very philosophically attractive, but it's very hard to do. And so that's what my reservation is, to do it well. And to really take seriously the idea of moving forward. I mean, you know, as Harry mentioned, when the paper is written, and it's always in the past. And so there's some kind of illusion about always being able to move forward. And so taken to, you know, the logical extreme, a witness perspective actually means that you would not write papers. You would not write papers. You would work with people thinking forward all the time. And so it kind of questions, what are we doing? If you really want to take that approach to what research is, action research does some of that, but it's always in the past by the time it gets written up. So it begins to question the potentialities of research. If you take the philosophical perspective that it represents to its logical conclusion, I think some of John Strauss's work was actually approaching that. So I believe that action research has a lot of potential, and but it's not quite witness yet. So that's
Yeah, I was really intrigued by this notion of witness, because I think it is there when you're doing your research, and it's almost a foregrounding and a backgrounding. Because I mean, I agree with you, Anne. Like, so I'm just going to talk about how, if I wanted to do that, and I collect lots of empirical data, it's one of the things I like to do. How would I do that? Well, of course I'm with, and I am withing throughout, and indeed, much of what we do to deal with our own emotional content in the field when I'm working with people is we send each other, the researchers, emails. And if you're on your own, you don't understand the email, just send the email anyway, to yourself. You know, at another researcher comes. Because you're dealing with your witness of being there, of how you feel about it. It's not always about you trying to influence them even. It's just about you being there and with them as it happens. But I tend to just write that out. I don't think I'm writing a theory about me and how I felt. or me and what I did. But of course, it's a very valid technique. It's just, I've always been interested in something else as a phenomena, and pragmatically I make a choice to let that go. Others might bring that in, and they might have more with accounts, even so that by the time you write your account. I mean, and would witness carry through to, so I see my data differently as I live with it. So, you know, after I've collected it, it's still very alive for me. And then I reread it, and I'm back there. And so is witness still happening when the period of collection is over, but I am with the data today in my analysis?
Yeah, I would argue that if you want to take it seriously, it would be. So that every time you would go back to your data, you would be with it in a different, you would have been in a different frame of mind because you have changed since the last time you looked at it. And so it kind of will, it sort of infinite regress if you like. So that's why I have a little reservation about it. But we can maybe approach it, but yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I'll be very brief on here. I kind of disagree a bit about a paper is finished, you know. There was a kind of, once it's published, that is. So there was a statement made by Bruno Latour, which is called immutable mobiles. They get published, it's immutable, but it becomes mobile, right? And so it has a force. But I'm more persuaded by scholars like Umberto Eco, for instance, or someone else, in which or Paul Ricoeur, in which, you know, the role of reader. We are not passive readers, and my papers are read, for instance, by many other people down the generations, and they come and tell me things which I've never thought about, actually. So they are with my papers, by the way. So can I make my papers in such a manner that there's possibilities of interpretive flexibility in my paper itself? As compared to many other things that once I've written the paper, I've proved the formula and I've found the things and it's done. So I do actually plug, you know, because Andy's drumming up business for AMD. Do submit out here, because maybe after 5 years, someone might read that stuff and say, okay, you know, we can give a different interpretation of this.
Witness thinking is a difficult notion and it gets often misunderstood. Now, let me say a few things by way of clarifying it. When John Shorten introduced it, we must remember he was a psychotherapist. Now, whenever he refers to it, he does not refer to it in order to theorize about the patient, but in order to effect change in the patient, in his relationship with the patient. Witness thinking is all about being very sensitive in the moment if you want to introduce change, to effect change in something. I think it's valuable. Now, how can we then take it into our field? Well, one is actual research, for example, when you try to capture the way your agents change, modify their views, and you're part of that change because you're instrumental in the whole process. Then, as Paula rightly said, however, and this is the limits of writing now, that postmodernists have written about. Now, when I write about the phenomenon, I'm not writing about myself. I myself am co-constitutive of the phenomenon I investigate, but nonetheless the paper is not about how I feel. So in that sense, we've got to make the pragmatic distinctions. By the way, this is the power of institutions. In the institutional game that we play, and I mean it in every serious way, not frivolously, in our kind of game, we are not so much focusing on ourselves like a novelist might be focusing on herself in the way she would be writing about her novel. In the kind of institutional game we play, we are focusing on the world outside us. Being mindful at the same time of our effect on the world, and that the phenomenon we experience and study is not independently given out there, but we partly help constitute it. So we've got to capture our role in it without, however, indulging ourselves and thinking that it is all about us. It is not about us. In that sense, Raghu, you're right, the paper is never finished. But if you're going to make a pragmatic kind of cuts and choices, the paper is finished when it's published for you. It's not finished for me. When I read your paper and I take it into my life and I'm influenced by it and the community, then the paper extends its life, of course. But from the point of view of the paper itself and the author, the paper is done. So one of the things that we often confuse in process research, I think, is what I said pragmatically. What is the phenomenon? What are you focusing on? There are certain things you've got to take for granted, and other things you need to explain because you're puzzled by. But you cannot begin to interrogate everything. Certain things, certain assumptions are made, certain things are taken for granted in order to focus on something else.
Quick question.
You got something?
I could, but go ahead.
Maybe you answer and take the other answer as well. So we're coming to the end of this session. So what are the big promises and the expectations of processual research for the future of management studies and for the future of management? What's your impression?
Oh my.
Why should we do this?
Our quest is to understand how things unfold, how things are done. That's our quest. We have this thirst to understand how things unfold, how we think. And if you look at the history of our past 40 years, perhaps, in our social science, we sort of relied upon behavior. When you talk about witness, because witness is what you see, it's what you do. In a sense, the practice perspective is grounded in that point of view. But then along in about the 70s came a cognitive turn. And so it's not what you do, it's what you think that explains how and why things unfold, and how I think is interpreted in many different ways, and so we're getting into all kinds of cognitive framing scripts, narratives, and stories that make sense. It provides a way of understanding what we do. But even that is not adequate for addressing a lot of other issues, especially when we have emotion, love, hate, revenge. All of these explain a lot of reasons, or perhaps generating mechanisms, for why people do what they do. But even that doesn't solve a lot of other issues about belonging, about being, about witness. Maybe the future goes more toward a faith, a vulnerability in the goodwill of others. It's a religion that provides an explanation for how and why I do what I do, perhaps, so that we can begin to think in the future that we need to begin to appreciate the important role of religiosity in management and organization behavior processes. I'll never forget Reverend Leon Sullivan saying one day, he was the architect of the principles of apartheid in South Africa, but he was also the pastor of the Zion Baptist Church in northern Philadelphia. And he observed that, people come to church on Sundays in order to get their pictures filled. Their pictures are a quest, a desire. Something has to fulfill their need for being. Thank you.
Unfortunately, we're out of time now, so I think that was a very good final question. How are we moving forward with all this? And very good answer. As we come to religion and religiosity, this is just amazing. We couldn't have foreseen that. So
the unexpected process.
The unexpected process. Thank you all for coming. So what we wanted to achieve was to showcase this kind of plurality of process research. We talked about all these kind of different things, really strong process views from flat to tall ontologies and so on. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you very much to the distinguished speakers who provided their insights to us. And we hope to see you around the next days. So thank you very much.